Hey, and welcome to another video from our Diversity and Inclusion Short Input series. My name is Nina Kiel, and I'm the head of Diversity and Inclusion at Flying Sheep Studios in Cologne. In case you've missed the introductory video on why you should care about diversity and inclusion, especially if you are a CEO, please make sure to check this one out first. You'll find the link in the description below. So today we are going to focus on a huge topic, which is cultural appropriation. Because it's such a complex one, I'll only be able to scratch the surface and offer some basic information, but I hope it will be helpful nonetheless. So let's dive right in. Cultural appropriation is a term that is attributed to American literature professor Arthur E. Christie, and he defined it as follows. Cultural appropriation, the unacknowledged or inappropriate adoption of the customs, practices, ideas, and so on of one people or society by members of another and typically more dominant people or society. Now, this definition is a good place to start a discussion, but you might already notice some issues with it. For example, what even is inappropriate? And perhaps even more importantly, what even is culture? Culture is a concept that seems easy to understand at first, but further thinking about it tends to lead to more questions than answers, at least from my experience. But fortunately, I found a framework that is by no means perfect, but it should be good enough for our purposes, for understanding the basics of this concept. And this framework displays culture as several layers surrounding the individual, as you can see here. Found this neat image in a video by PBS Origins. You can see the source here. Now first, there's shared ideologies and beliefs, the first circle. This could be, for example, the ideology of patriotism or maybe a religion. Both have a fixed set of values and ideas that are attached to them, and they can inspire cultural production. But they are also ideologies that exist even if they aren't being actively enacted. So you can feel patriotism even when you're not actively performing a ritual that displays it, like for example, hoisting a flag in front of your house. The second layer is the shared ways of life of a defined group of people, which means that this group interacts and lives in accordance with their common ideologies. This way of life could, for example, refer to eating, what you eat, when you eat, and who you share your meals with. And then there's the third and maybe most referenced, most important layer of all, when it comes to cultural appropriation at least, and that is cultural production. It's the most tangible form of culture because it manifests in paintings, literature, music, or fashion. So it's easy to perceive, to share, and to adopt or appropriate. And that brings us to the focus of this talk, cultural appropriation. So cultural appropriation, even though it's a relatively modern concept, has actually been going on for centuries because cultural artifacts were passed along trade routes and mislabeled as being of a certain origin. And even within certain cultures or countries, for example, clothing styles which first originated in lower classes could be later appropriated by the upper class. So there's actually a long and complicated history, and it's not limited to white people appropriating artifacts from other people and cultures. Now, one of the key challenges in defining appropriation is making the distinction between appropriation, appreciation, and cultural exchange. And most of us can probably agree that these are pretty clear-cut examples of cultural appropriation. But what about hairstyles, fashion, music, and art that is referencing other cultures? Where can we actually draw the line? And, well, the bad news is there's no clear line to draw because the distinction between appropriation and appreciation can vary vastly depending on who you ask. Some people will say that they feel seen and empowered when people from other cultures adapt, for example, traditional clothing styles. Other people will criticize the very same behavior, and others again will be completely indifferent about it. And this is not just true for individuals living in certain cultures, but also for scholars. Because to this day, there's really no consensus on what cultural appropriation actually entails. But there are a few key concepts that are commonly highlighted, which could help us understand this topic at least a bit better. The first one is power. So we cannot ignore in this discussion that there's a power imbalance between certain cultures, and that's sometimes rooted in centuries of oppression. So, for example, Black people have been and are still to this day shamed and stigmatized for their hair by white people. During the time of the slave trade, the slaves' hair was often cut or shaved off, which means that a crucial part of their culture and identity was just taken away from them. And even today, children are sometimes forced to have their hair cut or they're sent home because their natural hair does not conform to arbitrary standards for proper appearance in schools. So black hair and hairstyles are strongly connected to politics and a history of oppression. And when a white person decides to get, for example, dreadlocks or braids, they don't have to deal with any of this. They can just enjoy a style, which is not true for Black people. So there's actually a really good episode of Last Week Tonight that is focusing exclusively on this topic. If you want to learn more about it, make sure to watch it. It's really highly recommended. The next key concept is commodification. This means taking a cultural artifact and turning it into a product to sell. Of course, that's something that people from the respective cultures can also benefit from, especially in the tourism industry, right? But in the context of cultural appropriation, it specifically refers to taking something from another culture for personal gain and without sharing the profit. That's very important. So here's an example from the fashion industry. In 2019, fashion label Max Mara introduced a collection of dresses with very elaborate patterns. You can see them here. And these turned out to be direct copies of traditional Laotian designs. These intricate designs of the Oma people had just been scanned and turned into digital prints, without the consent of this group and without a single cent of the profits being shared with them. And this practice is especially troubling when it affects people who have suffered from colonialism, disenfranchisement, and poverty for years or even hundreds of years. Because the more you've lost, the more oppressive it can be when your remaining resources, such as cultural assets, are taken away from you. The third key concept is disconnecting cultural artifacts from their original meaning. There's a really good talk, a GDC talk about this, given by Ben Esposito when he reflects on the development process of a game called Kachina. For that game, he employed what he initially called Hopi folklore. So he'd seen these very elaborate dolls called Kachina dolls at gift shops, and he just thought they looked neat. So he used them as characters in early versions of the game. But what he didn't consider is that these are not characters, but actually an expression of the cultural and religious practices of the Hopi tribe. Practices that the tribe wants to see properly performed and protected. So this is actually a very good example of cultural appropriation, just taking something without doing proper research and making it your own, with the intent to financially benefit from it. There's a quote I found reading about this topic, about cultural appropriation in fashion, that gets to the heart of the issue. It says, "This magpie mentality, where all of culture and history is up for grabs as inspiration, has accelerated since the proliferation of social media. Where once a fashion student might research the history and traditions of a particular item of clothing with care and respect, we now have a world where images are lifted from image libraries without a care for their cultural significance." Now, one of the challenges we're facing today is that these processes already happened so often that it can actually be very difficult to identify important cultural artifacts as such. When we see an elaborate pattern somewhere online, we might just think it's pretty and then adapt it for our own work. And generally speaking, that's fine, because we are constantly borrowing from the world around us and we're inspired by ideas other people had before us. That's just a normal process. What's important, though, is the intent behind that process. It's that we try our best to be aware of the political and religious dimensions of these cultural artifacts. Now, there's a very comprehensive list of questions that you might want to check out when you are in doubt. I won't go through that entire list because, again, it's very comprehensive and I want to keep this talk short, but of course it's linked in the resource section that you will find in the description of this video. And ultimately, unfortunately, there's no really clear guideline on what constitutes cultural appropriation, but when you try to educate yourself and make informed decisions as often as possible, there's a really good chance you'll avoid major mishaps. But at the same time, I also want to point out that it's expected and it's also okay to make honest mistakes. And I'm actually a bit worried about the recent tendency to hyper-focus on these mistakes, especially in leftist circles. So I've noticed that discussions around cultural appropriation, especially online, often lack nuance. So forms of expression are not evaluated based on context and intention, but based only on perceived ethnicity and race. So for example, in this line of thinking, it's always okay when a person of color wears dreadlocks, but it's never okay for a white person to do the same. And this is an oversimplification because it ignores not only the crucial dimension of intent, but also important aspects such as class, positions of power, and the actual complexity of concepts such as race and ethnicity, because they are really not as easy to define as you might think. So I won't be able to go into this in detail now because this talk has already been longer than planned. But there's a really good article explaining this issue that I've linked in the resource section as well. What I want to say in closing is that it is important to be made aware of certain issues and to share this information with others. But hyperfocus and infighting especially can quickly lead to people losing track of overarching issues. So please always be mindful of that as well. Don't lose yourself in details. Try to find a balance. And when you're in doubt, if you're doing the right thing, maybe just ask someone who may know more about the topic than you do. So ideally that's one, or better yet, several people from the culture that you're referencing, because they might give you some helpful advice, share their opinions, and even resources that you can check out. So as always, keep the conversation going and educate yourself. Thank you so much for watching.